Hi, welcome to Material Physics 8, although, if I'm honest, it's not really material physics. It's not really anything, but this is just something I've been thinking about a lot recently, and I wanted to share with you guys before you went to university, because university is a fun place, but one thing that people spend a lot of time at university doing is have existential crises. They worry about, are we really here? What am I doing with my life? What is consciousness? And I wanted to look at consciousness not in terms of a philosophical bias, but in terms of physics. And what I'm going to try and argue here today is that you don't really need to worry about consciousness in the same way you don't really need to worry about matter. But we'll get to that. So, you should already know this, but it bears repeating. A proton is made up of 3 quarks. But interestingly, if you weigh the 3 quarks, you'll find their mass is less than that of the proton, which is very strange. But then what you realise is that there exists binding energy between the quarks, which we generally refer to as gluons, which I love. And this energy shows up as mass on the level of the proton. So if you zoom down to the level of the quarks, the mass disappears and just becomes energy. But there is this higher level effect of energy that if you get a lot of it together, it starts to look like mass. We also know that energy and mass are equivalent. We can move from one to the other. We also know that particles act like waves and waves act like particles. So energy, mass, wave, particles, they're all the same thing. They're all made up of the same stuff. Ultimately, it's just energy at the end of the day. But crucially, it turns out energy has this emergent extra property of being like mass if you get enough of it together and it's not too hot, too excited. Yeah? Now, is mass real? Well, it depends who you ask. Sometimes we say, well, no, mass isn't real. It's just this higher order property of energy. Other times, well, of course mass is real. You're standing on my foot. I can feel it. So it just depends how you look. But now stuff gets interesting, because you get enough of this energy mass stuff together, and it'll start forming particles. It'll start forming neutrons and protons and electrons. And then those neutrons and protons and electrons, if you put them in a sun for long enough, will start giving you all sorts of interesting chemicals. They'll start forming together into atoms of different sizes, and groups of those atoms will behave in different ways. So if you get 1 proton, it'll be hydrogen. You get 2 protons and 2 neutrons, it'll be helium, so on and so forth. Are those chemicals real? Again, it depends. If we're looking at it purely back from the energy, they're just a higher order property of the energy. However, if you breathe in some laughing gas and your voice goes all squeaky, you will again assume, well, the chemical must be real. I can hear the squeaky voice. So again, it just depends how you're looking at it. Chemicals are an emergent property of the particles, which is itself an emergent property of the mass, which is emergent upon having a lot of energy together. So it all depends what level we're looking at. Now it turns out, if you get enough chemicals on a planet and you leave them long enough, after a while, some of them will start to self-replicate. Now we've talked about the origins of life before, but it bears going over again because it's so much fun. My favourite current theory is the so-called clay reproduction theory, that the very first sort of things we might consider as life were just patterns in clay that could self-replicate. So it turns out certain patterns in clay will make more of themselves. At a certain point, these clay patterns got into some primordial soup and started to copy themselves onto hydrocarbons. So now what we have are replicating hydrocarbons, in a similar way to a virus. Virus, is it alive? Is it not? Difficult to say, but what it does do is make copies of itself very efficiently. So now we get something that we can sort of call self-replicating shapes. Is it alive? Is it not? Doesn't really matter, but turns out some of the chemicals will self-replicate. If you leave that process long enough in the self-replication, they'll start to select out the more efficient ones. And then you'll get protein chains that are good at breaking up other protein chains and turning them into themselves. And so on and so forth, until eventually you get jam and VAT and all the rest of it. So at some point, the self-replicating shapes turn into humans who have consciousness. How do we know they have consciousness? Well, sometimes they choose to wear really bad ties, or eat jam roly-poly, or all sorts of other really strange things that humans do. But this consciousness, well, the viruses don't have it. Is it real? I'd argue it's just another higher order property. You get enough of these hydrocarbons together, you get enough of this stuff in the same place under the right conditions, and this whole extra thing that you couldn't see before, consciousness, starts to come out. It's based on all these other higher order properties. It's no less real than mass or helium, but it's also not real, because it depends what level you're looking at. So there you go, a good thought to send you off to university with. I will speak to you next week. Have a good weekend.